My name is Lucy Henry. I do adult programs here at the Ridgefield Library. Tonight's speaker has been here once before, actually virtually. He did a great program on Eleanor Roosevelt. That was really popular. His name is Mark Albertson. He's the historical research editor at Army Aviation magazine, which is in Monroe. He's an avid public speaker of history, current events, and politics. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you very much. Can you folks hear me all right in the back?
Yep.
Okay, good. I guess I don't need the mic. Interesting you're having your remembrance of Ridgefield on Saturday. Interesting the following, not too long after that, you got May, which marks the 235th anniversary of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Interesting. Nice timing. Good timing. This topic, though, the well-regulated militia. Now, I'm not going to get stuck involved in these discussions about, guns versus anti-gun versus pro-gun. Not going there. This is more of a military talk as opposed to that. Although, let's understand something, there are Supreme Court justices in the 19th century who said that the militia system doesn't give the citizen the right to necessarily own a gun. Having said that, the rudiments of the American military system comes long before the Declaration of Independence. Go back to the French and Indian War. We call it the French and Indian War here, but what was it really? 7 Years' War. And Winston Churchill actually called that the world's first world war. Because the British and the French are not only fighting here, they're also fighting in India. Of course, that's going to turn out to be the crown jewel of the British Empire, and the British want to put paid to the French here. But, coming back to our neck of the woods, many Americans, George Washington being one, because he led the Virginia militia as an adjunct to the British troops. That's interesting because the average British soldier was carrying like about 60 pounds, 70 pounds of equipment into battle. You know how much the French were carrying? 12. And the Indians, they're lucky if they're wearing loincloths. So it was more of a guerrilla effort from the French and the Indians as opposed to a full-fledged conventional riposte by the British. However, having said that, this is where Americans begin to learn the military art here. And this is according to the United States Army, who have done, and I've got these histories home, from the Center of Military History in Washington, D.C. This is where the Americans really begin to learn the military art. And having fought with the British, some of these people actually got an education here on how to fight the British later on. Because that war will be from 1756 to 1763. And after that, you know what happens here. The British had borrowed a large amount of money from the banks to fight this war. So did the French, by the way, and that's going to help bring on the French Revolution in 1789. In fact, it was costing the British taxpayer to station troops here in 1757, 75,000 pounds a year. Well, what do you think happens to the cost of war as war goes on? Where do they go? Yeah, that's pretty good. That's pretty good synopsis here. Up. And by 1763, it was costing the British taxpayer 350,000 pounds. It went up 5 times in 7 years. So when the war is over with, they got to pay the banks back, right? Banks don't lend money out for nothing. This isn't a charity show here. And so they want the colonists to begin to help the British taxpayer pay off that nut, that bill. And you think all the colonists want to pay this? No, they don't. No, they don't. And so you begin to see the hardening of the stances here from 1764 on into 1774, 1775. And interesting what develops here too, and this is where this is going to go. Remember the Sons of Liberty? Remember them? What do you think they were? They're a bunch of terrorists. That's what they were. And I'm not knocking them. Don't think I'm knocking them. I'm not. Just making an accurate assessment. They used to break up court sessions. They used to threaten judges. In fact, there was an incident up in New Haven. The tax stamp administrators for the British government, you know, when you had the tax stamps on all the paper, whether it was legal, newspapers, almanacs, so on and so forth. The fellow up in New Haven, British tax stamp administrator, got a number of visits from the Sons of Liberty. You know, warning him to knock it off or get out of New Haven. I'm not leaving. They burned him in effigy, began to rip up his land and so on and so forth. And finally they told him, either you get out or you won't be getting out. So he left. And this is interesting from the perspective that many of these guys are going to wind up in the Continental Army. Well, where else are they going to go once the war starts? But interesting here too, in 1774, you actually begin to get a civil war starting here between the colonists. Those that want the divorce from the crown, those that don't want the divorce from the crown. Massachusetts, Nathan Fisk, who's a Protestant cleric. He's an interesting case. He's running all up and around Massachusetts. Protestant cleric. Grab a gun, kill the Brits, throw them out. In fact, T.L. Breen, who was a professor at North Carolina University in Chapel Hill, wrote a book called The American Insurgency. And that irks me that we don't talk more about that. I call them partisan patriots. The guys who weren't in the Continental Army, who fought an insurgency, a people's war. And Nathan Fisk is running around galvanizing the people. Grab a gun, kill the British, throw them out. Breen has said there are a number of American historians who called him, if you want to use the term, an American colonial version of Osama bin Laden. Interesting. And so here you begin to see the hardening of the positions here. And here you're beginning to see the colonists here. John Adams once made the remark that the colonists were divided into three categories. Those who were blue, true blue, you know, the patriots. Those who were Tories and Loyalists, and those who were undecided. And obviously the other two camps are trying to push the fence sitters off the fence on their lie of the land here to get more converts. And as this goes on, in fact, Crane Brinton wrote a book called Anatomy of Revolution. He wrote this book in the 1930s. And in this book, you know, he updated it in the 1940s and 1950s. And in this book, he talked about what was going on here, 1774, 75, 76, as part of this anatomy of the American Revolution. And an incident occurred not all that far from here, in New Milford. And a bunch of patriotic colonists found out they had a Tory in their midst. And they went to his farm, armed. And they urged this man to pick up one of his geese. And they marched this guy 20 miles to Ridgefield. When they get to Ridgefield, there's a boiling vat of hot tar waiting. They stripped this guy as naked as a jaybird once he plucked the goose, hit him with the tar, and hit him with the feathers. What would you call that? Terrorizing? Torture? And that went on here. However, as the war itself starts, you will see a guerrilla movement down south. Francis Marion, Thomas Sumter. And interesting here is what we don't seem to remember about our own guerrilla movements here. It was hit the Brits, and then go back into the Carolina swamps. How many guys here were in Vietnam? Isn't that what the VC was doing? They hit the Americans and then back into the Mekong River Delta, right? What is it what we forgot here in 1780 and then versus 1965? What do you think the Russians were facing in Afghanistan with the Mujahideen in the mountains? It's the same sort of thing, isn't it? Of course it is. However, you will have your Continental Army. And that will be a ragtag band of farmers who will later become a decent conventional army by the time it's over with. But interestingly enough, coming on to the militia system, with the Articles of Confederation the Continental Congress really didn't have the power to tax. And these guys in these armies, the Continental Army, were promised, the soldiers that is, were promised new uniforms, to be fed. Officers were promised a half-pay pension for life. Where's that money coming from? What do you think the Continental dollar was worth? The wallpaper the walls with them. Although I wish I had one now. It's probably worth a few bucks. And interestingly enough, revolts and mutinies began to start. 1780, they had a Connecticut regiment revolted in Hartford, had to be put down. And Washington is saddled with this. Again, the war is almost over here, but it's interesting that the British, resplendent in their their red coats and their white pants and black boots, they look like they won. They lost. It's the army, the ragtag band, that won. And yet, at this point, 1780, 1781, there are guys in this army, and in the cold weather months, 3, 4, or 5 of them are sharing the same coat? Where's the money coming from? And when they bivouac next to a patriotic farm, sometimes those Americans in those patriotic farms didn't want their own army bivouacking in the field next to their pastures. Why? Because of the midnight requisitions, as they were called. These guys got to eat. So you're going to be missing a few chickens, a pig, maybe a cow. They got to eat. And so there are numerous mutinies and revolts within some of these formations, and they've got to be put down. In fact, this is interesting. This is George Washington, the Commander-in-Chief. George Washington. This is to Robert Howe, West Point, January 22nd, 1781. He's urging the commander of West Point to take up his detachment and march on New Jersey. Why? There's a regiment there in revolt. And this is what he says. This is George Washington. If you succeed in compelling the revolted troops to surrender, you will instantly execute a few of the most active and most incendiary leaders. They shot at least 2. That's Washington. And people are shocked at this. People are actually shocked at this. Now that, you might say, is a Stalinist approach to the problem. Well, check that. Stalin would have wiped out the whole regiment and moved on from there. That's not what, but he's got to make examples. One regiment was going to march on the Continental Congress with cannon to impress their demands. But the big one though is March 1783. March 15, 1783, Newburgh, New York. That's where the officers are closeted up after the Revolution. The officers. Now, some of these officers are thinking, gee whiz, we now have an army, right? And I now have a career as an officer. They're in for a rude shock. They're in for a rude shock. Your founders aren't this stupid after this episode and after Shays' Rebellion, too. They get a dose of fear here, which is why they're going to opt at Philadelphia for a republic and not a democracy. Your founders didn't like democracy. They knew it wouldn't work. So they opted for a republic. And so in March 15, 1783, there are officers here closeted up at Newburgh. And Horatio Gates, now his part in this is a little hazy here, so is Alexander Hamilton's, about using the troops to impress the demand, like Hamilton's, who wanted a strong central government as opposed to Jefferson, who wanted a weaker form of central government. And some of these officers actually want Washington to lead them on Philadelphia. They want that half-pay pension, wouldn't you? Of course you would. Washington shows up, and Gates is on the stand here, and Gates sees who shows up, and he gets off. Washington takes his place in front of the officers. Washington was a fan of stage play, and he made a great fanfare about taking his glasses out and putting them on. And he begins to give this speech. And by the time that speech is over with, some of these guys are crying. I shared the trials and tribulations with you, despite the fact he's well off. I froze, you froze. We all shared the sacrifices here. And he said, and we're not even a nation yet. We gave up some of this for our nation. Nope, we're not a nation yet. But I gave it. And he also says, when he's putting his making fanfare, putting the glasses on, I gave up something too, my eyesight. And what do you think happened to the sails of rebellion here? No, because it's Washington. But this lesson is not lost in Philadelphia, because the founders will not want a large standing army. You know, you're going to have a country, after all is said and done, what, 13 states, anywhere from 3.5 to 4 million people. You know what the regular army is going to be? 2,630 men. How are 2,630 men going to defend 13 states and the entire eastern seaboard? How's that going to work? The militia system. That's how it's going to work. The militia system. You know, your founders consulted things like Athenian democracy, the Roman Republic, and they found something here. The Athenian democracy will collapse. One of the reasons it's going to collapse, the hoplite revolution. You know, the hoplites were Greek soldiers, Greek infantry. And when Athens was moving away from democracy towards empire, what were they doing? They were promising the people, become the men, forget the women, the men, be a hoplite, and as we take territory, you're going to get part of this. Well, what do you think some of these guys are doing? They're becoming an empire. Rome. You know, the Roman Republic. They're going to eventually become an empire. How'd they do this? They promised men, you know, plebeians, so on, the mass, join the army, and you help us create this empire, and you'll get land. You know, land is a determinant of power. That's what your country's founded on, you know, private property. We're the antithesis of Marxism. It's founded on private property. I know I got this liberty, freedom, and democracy stuff when I was in school too, but that's not how the country's formed. Your founders believed that private property is your ticket to human rights, civil rights, and your ability to vote. Isn't that how the country started? No land, you can't vote, right? That's how it started. Private property. Interesting. And so here, but the founders don't want this kind of an army, because they're afraid an army like this will mark the end of the republic. They also look at Britain. They look at France. And that's not what they want here. So we're going to have a small standing army bolstered by the militia system. And what's the militia system? You know, when you get into this Second Amendment discussion, many times something's left out of this. It's called the 1792 Militia Act. Interesting piece of legislation. You ought to read it. These militias will not be run by the Army or the federal government. They'll be run by the governors. Officers apply to these militias. Guess who picks them? The states. All white males, 18 to 45, are in the militia. Guess who buys their guns for them? Not the Army. You do. You buy your musket, your powder, your ball, your shirts, your pants, your shoes, your coonskin cap if you want one. And these militias, according to the Constitution, the President can ask Congress to federalize the militias if he needs them to bolster the regulars. He can. But in the 1792 Militia Act, 3 months. That's it. Then he's got to go back and ask for extension. Now, why did the founders do this? Because if you have a person in person as president and he gets too big for his britches, how do you keep him in line? The militias, the armed citizenry. The armed citizenry. Interesting concept, isn't it? Does it work? Yeah, to a fashion. To a fashion it works. But the United States will not have a large standing army for years. Years. War of 1812. There were of course, now you've got political parties, and that's a problem. Federalist versus Democrat, Republican. You know what George Washington said in his farewell address? He was against what he called over-bloated militaries. In 1796, is one of the best farewell addresses ever done by any retiring president. I've been giving talks on this lately. And he said, an overburdening military is inauspicious to liberty. What did Eisenhower say in 61? Remember that one? Beware the military-industrial complex. Here you've got two guys who were generals, and both were presidents, twice. You don't think they don't know? Of course they do. Of course they do. But Washington also warned against the spirit of the party. He says parties breed factionalism. And you will find in every political party people who will observe the precepts of the party before the precepts of the nation. You don't think you're not seeing that right now? If you don't, you're blind as a bat. Interesting. Interesting. But in the War of 1812, there were governors in our neck of the woods who were Federalists who were telling Madison, my guys aren't fighting outside the state borders. We're at war. We're at war. Henry Dearborn, remember him? Revolutionary War general? Well, he was brought back as a general for the War of 1812. Probably about 80 pounds overweight, and they had to have a special wagon for him to run him around. He was supposed to launch an invasion from Plattsburgh and attack Montreal. He left Plattsburgh. He's got a combination force of Army regulars and New York State militia. They got to the border, the New York-Canadian border, and the militia, okay, this is as far as we go. That was the end of that offensive. He went back to Plattsburgh. And you can't run an operation like this. Of course, things changed when the British burned Washington, and then they got held up at Baltimore, and everything changed here. Of course, one place where the militia and the regulars really worked well, and that was New Orleans, under Andy Jackson. You know, out of 5,400 men, maybe 1,200, 1,400 were regulars. The rest were militia and volunteers. Of course, we're talking Andy Jackson. When he gave you an order, you did it. End of discussion. But here, when this war is over with, there is a discussion in Congress to extend the Army and make it 10,000 men, regulars. We're still going to have the militia system, but we're going to add to the size of the regular Army. Well, we're getting bigger, aren't we? Aren't there more people here? More territories are becoming states. You do need a larger Army. That should be a given. But Congress appropriates only enough money for 8,200 men. It's still going to have to be the militias that take up the slack here. Mexican-American War. Sure, there's going to be over 35,000 regulars, many volunteers and militia, but once the war is over with, they cut the Army again. This idea of a small regular army still resonates decades into the country's history. But then comes 1861. This is a horse of a different color. Well, Lincoln wants 75,000 volunteers. And interesting, too, and he'll be criticized for this, and to me you can't criticize him, because what's going on in Mexico? Didn't Napoleon III put French troops in Mexico to try to create another empire here for the French? And he put in Maximilian, a representative from the house, from the Habsburgs in Austria, put him to run the satrap in Mexico. And that started a guerrilla war with Don Benito Juarez. And there were some in Congress who were telling Lincoln, you know, isn't that a violation of the Monroe Doctrine? Well, how's Lincoln supposed to solve that problem when he's got the Confederacy to fight? Not going to work too well. However, in this war, and this will be America's first industrialized war. We don't seem to understand that. They always teach it as a civil war. I look at it as America's first industrialized conventional war. You got a nation called, which is the champion of agrarian capitalism, versus the North, which is the champion here of industrial/finance capitalism. You know, the Southerners had 20,683 factories. How many the North had? Over 110,000. The Southerners had about 120,000 factory workers. The North, over 1,100,000 factory workers. And you can tell where this war is going to go. You know, in 1860, the South produced 76,000 tons of steel. You know how much the North produced? Try 2,500,000 tons. Who's going to win this war? Who's going to win this war? And when this war is over with, the North, the day the Southerners gave up the ghost, April 9, 1865, the North has an army of 2,213,000 men, according to the Army records. That's a professional army. That's a conventional army backed by an industry up here. That's not what Congress wants. And by September 1767, try 57,000 men. The Navy, 676 combat ships. By 1868-69, 43. By 1876, the year Custer ran into that problem on the Little Bighorn. There were 26,000 men in the United States Army. And everything they had learned about conventional warfare, now they're down to chasing Plains Indians. And there were, during the American Civil War, it's interesting here that they do this anyway. Many of the leading European nations sent liaison officers here to watch this. And it's interesting what America is really offering here. This is the first war with railway mounted artillery. The machine gun comes out. Gatling gun? We're getting away from the musket. Breech loaders? Rapidity of firing? Better digging trenches. What did they forget in 1914, what they saw in 1864 here? The machine gun was taking a toll here in 1914. Another thing that comes out, and where I work in Army Aviation magazine, this resonates big with us. The Balloon Corps, the Army's first sojourn into air power. You know, change and modernization is in the wind. This is the threat to the militia system. The Balloon Corps, on June 18, 1861, Thaddeus Lowe, probably the real aviator of his time, the Charles Lindbergh of his time, only with gas bags, leaves the Columbia Armory and goes up 1,000 feet. He's got 2 men in the basket with him. And he's got a telegraph in the basket. Writes out a note, gives it to the telegrapher. There are lines going from the telegraph down the static lines of the balloon that attach it to the ground. One goes to Alexandria. One of the feeder lines goes to Alexandria. One goes to General Winfield Scott's headquarters, who was not a fan of the balloons anyway. Of course, he's an old man. He's 73, 74 at the time. He's still in command of the Army. One went to the White House. Abraham Lincoln is the first head of state in history to receive an electronic message from an aircraft in the air to the ground. He's enamored with this. I want the balloon corps. And they'll use this for 3 years. The Army disbands it in 1863, but it works. This is the modernization of war that's coming on here. That's really coming on. Yet, we're going to get rid of all this. However, in the 1870s and 1880s, it's the Hamiltonian notion that wins the war. The Jeffersonian notion was defeated. We are now becoming an industrialized state. That's going to change everything. In the 1880s, the new Steel Navy. That's where we're going. The Maine is built. The Texas is built. They're called battleships. They're really armored cruisers. They're battleship prototypes. The first American battleship's the Indiana of 1895. It's over 10,000 tons. That's where we're going. And you are seeing people come along here like Alfred Thayer Mann, who writes that book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, showing the rudiments or the benefits of a large navy. Protects your shores from an opposing navy. Why do you want that opposing navy to reach your shores? If you have a strong enough navy, you can prevent that opposing navy from reaching your shores. The book's a worldwide hit. This is following like On War by Karl von Clausewitz. He gives talks all over the world, man. And guess who's on his page? Teddy Roosevelt. Henry Cabot Lodge, remember him? Yeah, interesting. And then, because of the fact, by the mid-1890s, we knocked off the British as the world's ranking industrial power. We go from 131,000 factories approximately in 1860 to 300,000 by 1900. We produced $2 billion in manufactured goods in 1860. Try $11.5 billion by 1900. Went up 5.5 times in 40 years. You can't have a militia system anymore. You were getting on the world stage. Spanish-American War. We are now cutting our colonial roots, and we are now becoming an imperialist power. We are joining that club of imperialists. The British, the French, the Spanish, and Dutch, and the Portuguese, they're dying here. Germany becomes now one of those which the British and French didn't want, and they're going to get us to help them in 1917 and knock the Germans off. Tsarist Russia. And another one coming up, Japan. They joined the club. Although that doesn't set well with some of the Europeans. The majority of the members of this club are white, Christian, and European. And now we got somebody with yellow skin, round heads, and slanted eyes. There goes the neighborhood. That's literally what some of them are thinking here. But we're going to join this club. We get Puerto Rico. We actually move into Guam. We take Cuba and the Philippines. The Navy puts on a good show here. The Army needs work. The Army needs work. You actually had governors here in 1898 telling President McKinley the same thing those governors were telling the President of the United States in the War of 1812. My guys aren't fighting outside the state borders. If Spain invades us, they'll fight. So McKinley has to ask for volunteers, 150,000, to bolster the 26,000-man Army. The Army does put in a decent show on Puerto Rico and on Cuba, in particular Cuba. But we need an Army. And McKinley's going to hire a man with the name of Elihu Root, a New York lawyer. Never been in the military before, but the man can think. He's a good organization man. And in 1901, he begins to make what's known to history as the Root Reforms. There will now be an Army War College. The Navy already has one. In 1903, a new act is passed, the National Guard Act. And in 1903, they will no longer be called the militias. It's the National Guard Act. Here, these guys are no longer going to be buying their own guns. These meetings will be more than drinking bouts. For 5 days every year, the National Guard now has to train with the United States Army. Officers will be applied by who? The Army. And for those 5 days that they are going to train with the Army, they now get paid. They have to meet 24 times a year on their own. Oh, and they're not going to be federalized anymore for 3 months. Try 9. And on top of that, subsidiary legislation passed will allow the president to deploy them now overseas, which does not work well with some governors. Why? Because of the anti-guerrilla effort going on in the Philippines. Remember, we helped the Cubans, we helped the Filipinos throw the Spanish out, and then we decided we don't want to leave. It's like, gee, thanks for the help. When you leaving? We're not. We're not. So they need men. Subsidiary legislation in 1908 turns back that deployment overseas, but that'll return. 1916, the National Defense Act of 1916. Now these National Guardsmen will not train with the Army 5 days a year, try 15. They will not meet 24 days a year, it's now 48, and now they're going to start getting paid for that. Of course, what happens the following year? 1917. Congress issues the declaration of war, and we are now in the first chapter of the Great War. I say first chapter because I am not one of those who believes in this World War I, World War II stuff. There's only one war here. Starts in 1914. It's not over in 1918. It comes to a short conclusion in 1922, not 1918. And then the Japanese jump started in 31, and it goes on to 45. But you now need a professional armed force for America to take its place on the world stage. The militia system no longer qualifies. You can't expect these guys to wear all different sorts of clothes and buy their own guns. Doesn't work this way. And in the 1920 National Defense Act, the commanding general of the National Guard now has a seat on the general staff. You see what happened here? From 1792 to 1920? And what's happening? Stronger central control as America takes its place on the world stage. And then you get to World War II, and I always bring this up. Many of these I used to sell cars years ago, and there was a guy I used to work with. He was 93, he was still selling cars. Joe Ruggieri, maybe some of you remember him from selling cars on Route 7. And he said he was, to show you how old this guy was, he was due to get out of the Army in 41, the National Guard. And he said, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, boy, they stuck it to me good. I'm in for the duration. He wound up fighting in Italy. He said, I'm the smallest guy in the platoon, and they give me the BAR. He said, no, he said, that's the Army. But here you see, interesting, how where America's gone in this process, from being an agrarian state to the world's most powerful industrialized state. And the National Guard is now considered a bona fide reserve of the United States Army. And the governors have lost more and more control here. When they wielded a lot of control in 1792. So it's interesting, this progression, how the militia system became the National Guard, and how we really don't have a well-regulated, the National Guard is not that well-regulated militia. It's not that well-regulated militia. It's a bona fide reserve of the United States Army, a professional force the founders did not want. Interesting what happened here. Anybody have any questions or comments or observations that they want? Yes, sir.
You mentioned something about by 1901 we were going to have an Army University, or I forget exactly how you termed it.
Army War College.
Army, thank you.
Right.
But we had West Point.
Right.
So can you just, if it doesn't diverge too much?
No, not at all. That's part of this. No, West Point's actually a military university. You're going to learn more than just the military here. But it was thought that if we're going to, there was a man during the Civil War, Emory Upton. I know the name sounds funny, but he served valiantly in the Civil War, a Northern soldier, and he got to be an officer. And William Tecumseh Sherman, when he became Commander-in-Chief of the United States Army, thought we ought to have a more modern force. This is in the 1870s. And he sends this young man, Upton Emory, who was a colonel at this point, around the world to see what the other countries are doing. He went all over the place. And when he came home, he said, his advice is, there's one country we ought to emulate here if we're going to build a professional army. And that's to have the general staff, the Prussian general staff. That's not what Congress wants to hear. They don't want to hear that one. Otto von Bismarck is not president of the United States. We're not doing this. But when I mention a lieu route, that's the report he reads, going into 1901. And so, yes, we're going to have this school, which Sherman wanted, a school beyond West Point to teach officers. Only this is specifically for what? War. Not just a university like West Point, it's war. And then they're going to come out with another one, the Army Command and General Staff College. That's even above the Army War College. That one's in Leavenworth. And here, if you show promise as an officer, guess where you're going? The Army Command and General Staff College. And these are guys who usually become colonels and then brigadiers and on up. So now it's actually a progression here. It's almost like an assembly line of people who show real promise, and they're going to go up the ranks. So that shows what? You have to have a professional army in today's world. They're all doing this. All these countries do this. What do you think they did in the Soviet Union? You know, in the Soviet Union, when you went to the military academy, those guys played chess. And you know what else they were reading? Sherlock Holmes. Because they thought Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was the English you wanted to read. Interesting what some of these countries do. But that's the course we're charting here. Well, the Navy War College, Air Force has an academy. And sometimes when I do research on air power, I go to the Air University in Alabama. I got a lot of old studies from the Army Air Force here, which I archive and put in my files. And I go to the Army Command and General Staff College, the Center of Military History in Washington, D.C. There's a lot of studies written here. And as a little tip, if you really get into this, you will find that when you're reading things like about what happened in Iraq, Afghanistan, that's not what's in the New York Times. But you can go there. You can go there. But this idea of a professional armed force, as America takes its place in the world, had to be. You can't go with the old militia system. The country changed. The country changed. The militia system won't work. And that's what they did. That's what they did. That's what they did.
Can you expand a little bit more on what they were doing at West Point, however, in the 1700s, and how it developed in the 1800s, if it was a more formal
Well, yeah, interestingly enough, Alfred Thayer Mann, Captain Alfred Thayer Mann, I once mentioned him about his book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. His father taught at West Point.
There's a Thayer Hall.
Beg your pardon?
There's a Thayer Hall.
Right, exactly. And interesting what he did, you know, yes, they did teach military tactics here. And The Art of War by Baron, what was his name? No, it was, and they didn't really teach Karl von Clausewitz. Oh, I'll get the name. He wrote a book called The Art of War. He actually advised Napoleon, and then left Napoleon and went to Tsar Alexander I and was advising him. But he wrote on Napoleonic warfare. That was popular at West Point. And guess what? When the Civil War starts, guess who taught them? They all came out of West Point. That's why the Civil War is sometimes called by military experts the West Pointers' War. But Alfred Thayer Mann's father taught a lot of these officers who will later use them. Remember, they were using Napoleonic tactics in the American Civil War. The long lines of infantry, that kind of thing. But what happened when repeating firearms came out? Yeah, things changed. Things changed. Things changed. But West Point was our military academy here. Well, it's still called the Point of the Military Academy. But in today's world, you know, with the growing sophistication and specialization in war, you saw that with industrialization, the evolution of technology here. You can't have a militia system. It's not going to work. The specialization of tasks. It's like going to a GP and asking them to operate on your brain. It's not going to work. You can't expect somebody in a regular ragtag militia to fly an Apache attack helicopter. This is not going to work. Specialization of tasks. The sophistication of war. And that's what you saw here. So you had to upgrade yourself. And that means you have to educate these gentlemen. And now ladies, don't be surprised. There are a number of really good Apache attack helicopter pilots and they're women. You don't have to be a muscle man to pull a trigger. You don't have to be that way. So it's interesting where the military has gone from the militia system to what you have now. Somebody, yeah, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was just wondering, can you trace the origins back to a single pinpoint of the industrial military complex, to the Gatling gun or to the National Guard Act, or where do you think that?
Yeah, it's called levée en masse, conscripting entire populations and economies for war. And to preface this, you know, the 30 Years' War, 1618, 1648 in Europe, 5 to 8 million Europeans died in that war. And this is where you didn't have enough nobility. What'd you do? You pulled the serfs out of the fields, give them a pipe. You know, this isn't sophisticated. Get in line. Well, when a lot of these people died, when the war is over with, who's planting the crops and who's reaping the crops? What do you think happened after the war? Starvation, right? Okay, so they're going to change things. They're going to make war more professional. The nobility of the officers, although a lot of the soldiers are going to be guys who are in debtor's prison, indentured servants. They can work off the debt that way. But in August of 1793, the French Revolutionary War, which is the first of a two-part war, followed by the Napoleonic Wars. And France is going to be invaded by the monarchies of Europe. You need men. And so now you begin to see levée en masse. Lazare Carnot is the man who starts this. In August of 1793, we are going to organize the entire population and economy for war. And with capitalism fueling industrial building factories, of course, France is still overwhelmingly agrarian. But they're going to organize the entire economy and technology. You know, with more factories, you can build more weapons, right? And as technology is fueled by capitalism, with each new mark of weaponry, you're coming out with weapons that will reap an ever greater harvest of humanity. So what do you got to do to take up the slack here? You gotta conscript the entire population. And at this point, all white males, 18 to 25, not married, guess where they're in? A uniform. You are beginning to see what's going to happen in the 20th century. Because in 23 and a half years of war, 6.5 million Europeans are going to be killed in this war. The Great French War by 1850. 1914 to 1918, now industrialization of war is on steroids. Over 15 million dead. And then from 39 to 45, upwards of 60 million dead with industrialized war. You see what man did with his industry and technology? So you begin to see here these rapid inventions coming for war. The Gatling gun, I brought that up. How about the monitor? You can turn a turret now on a ship. You don't have to change the ship to train the guns. You can go straight and just turn a turret. See what man's doing with his technology in war? It's fascinating to see the bomb sights. You know, now you don't just look over the side and just go like this. You don't do that anymore. You've now got bomb sights, bomb bay doors. You see what's happening? And you have to have trained personnel for this. Militia systems? Forget it. They're a thing of the past. I hope that answers your question for you. Because that's what you saw between 1793 and 1945. Yes?
So I was just looking at articles in February about militias forming in Ukraine. And if you don't want to go there, you don't have to go there. But so you're saying that militias and small armed fire, maybe in the past, but it seemed to be coming back in Ukraine. Is that a real thing? Is there a place for small armed gunfire or small armed warfare in the modern world? Or
Well, some countries would call them militias. You know, they can still use the term, although in this country, militia seems, with some people, have gotten to be a dirty word. And I disagree with that. In fact, if you look at the top of that handout I gave you, it says armies of the uprooted and disinherited. That was actually a 5-talk set I gave at Norwalk Community College at the Dearborn Library about these armies of, what I call armies of uprooted and disinherited, the Freikorps in Hitler's SA, the Mujahideen. And the week after I did this talk about the well-regulated militia, I did the unregulated militia. Proud Boys, Patriot Front, things like this. That's what's given, it's more than that, that's what's helped give the term militia a dirty name. Now in Ukraine they might call them militias, but what I'm looking for in Ukraine is an insurgency. That's what I'm looking for. And you're beginning to see it start now. How's that going to work? When some of these Ukrainians cross the border into Russia and blow a power station or blow a bridge. That's what I'm looking to see here. But, you know, is that sort of a militia? Well, it's the people. It's the people's war. Such as maybe we had here at one point. Interesting. Hasn't died. And that's why I purposely put some of those quotes in that handout from people like Lenin and Mao. Lenin and Mao. You know, to Lenin, if you're adverse to learning the art of firearms, you deserve to be a slave. Mao, political power comes from the barrel of a gun. Try refuting that. But then again, there's your Thomas Jefferson, who once remarked about this. The tree of liberty is watered with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It's its natural manure. That's what he said. Talking about militias, revolution, that kind of thing. But yeah, you could see that occurring in Ukraine. You know, they have a regular army, but then again, what's going to bolster that army? An insurgency or a militia, if you want to call it that? You know, people with RPG-7s and AK-47s. They're not going to be carrying, perhaps, the Stingers or the Javelin. The Army will do that. But if you're going to have an insurgency, they're going to be operating behind the lines. They're going to be operating behind the lines. And the longer this goes on, you might see that develop. You might see that develop. Not saying it will, but you might see it develop. Because look what the Mujahideen did to the Russians in Afghanistan. Yeah. So, interesting. The people just picking up a rifle and doing what they think they need to do. Fascinating. It truly is. It truly is. Anybody else have any questions or comments or observations? No? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah,
No,
I guess
no.
just, like, where do you see the future of it going? Like, the future of militaries and the future of the industrial military complex?
Yeah, we're in the technology revolution, so you don't need as many bodies anymore.
Just need unmanned drones.
That's part of where we've gone here. I mean, you can have somebody sitting on his duff, or her duff, sitting in front of a computer screen in Rochester, New York, alighting a drone from Colorado or California, zap a target in Afghanistan, and then at the end of the day, take the wife and the kids out to dinner. You know, you're not seeing this and they're fascinating to talk to, although there's hardly any of them left. Talk to those guys that were in those B-24s and B-17s bombing Germany. You get 500 bombers, each with 10, 12 guys each, and they're bombing targets. That's saturation bombing. It's strategic bombing. Now, we don't seem to have that now. Of course, we're not in a war like that. Let's understand that. We're not in a war like that. But everything is very sophisticated now. So you don't need as many bodies. Yet, even today, though, don't you still need somebody with a rifle to hold what's left? At this point? And we've heard this, and I can quote much of this verbatim. Even after the First World War, there were some of these strategic airmen who were saying, well, we don't need to resort to an army anymore. They said this in the 1920s, the 1930s, and after the bomb was dropped, the 2 bombs dropped. Oh, the atomic bomb's going to change everything. What do you even need an infantry division for? Korea proved that, so did Vietnam. And so it's interesting how, the bomb was going to change everything, maybe even make war obsolete? No. Yes, sir.
It's probably not a fair question to ask, but these oil refinery fires that are burning out of control 60 miles from Ukraine where it lands in Russian territory,
Yeah.
are you supposing that this is not part of a strategy coming from Kyiv, or do you think it's locally inspired or possibly directed by separate groups of militia, if you will?
Maybe all the above.
Yeah.
Not knowing the particulars, I know about the incidents, but not knowing the particulars, I wouldn't even speculate at this point.
We get the information.
Right. Right. Although the Russians have had a problem here because, their armed forces were about 900,000 men, with reserves of 2 million. Most of their soldiers were contracted. They're professionals, they're volunteers, they're contracted. The other quarter or 1/3 are conscripts. Well, that's another one coming on here, but they were conscripts, Russians who were just drafted. The Russians draft twice a year, April 1 to July 15, and then October 1 to December 31. And they get anywhere from upwards of 300,000 men out of a pool of 1 million every year or so, about 1 million. They get about maybe 300,000, even 400,000 men a year. Now, when these conscripts report, they give them basic training for 4 to maybe 8 weeks. Then they're going to be applied to a certain task. They're going to get another 4 to maybe 8 weeks of training for that. Their enlistment is for a year. After the year, they go into the reserves. The problem here is, according to the reports I'm getting, that the Russians have lost too many of the volunteers, professional soldiers, and they're filling in the slots with conscripts. How long are you going to be able to do that? Doesn't that disrupt unit cohesion, perhaps? Could be. Morale, that's supposedly another problem. So now, and I was just reading a report before I came here, that they already have, supposedly, according to the Institute for the Study of War, 10,000 to 20,000 international troops, Libyans, Syrians. They already got 5,000 Chechens in Luhansk and Donetsk. And so, where's this going here? Where is this going? Of course, if the Syrians and Libyans die, who cares? They don't care. But, you know, Putin is calling in a marker to Assad. I did you a favor. Guess what? You can do me a favor. And there was also in that report, although I don't know, you can read all these reports, but do you believe all of them? No matter the source here, that even Ethiopians were going up to the Russian embassy in Ethiopia to sign up because they want money. These guys are poor. We can go to Ukraine and fight and get paid, maybe $800 a month. Wow. Yeah. So, but oil, it's one of the reasons you got this war anyway, right? It is. We don't want the Europeans buying Russian oil and gas, and they don't want the Europeans buying American oil and gas. A lot of this is about pipelines anyway. I mean, Ukraine is just around 3,585. You'll have around 3,586, and you're going to have one 3,587. Where's it going to be? I don't know, but you're going to have them because the great powers need the resources. So, and wheat is another one. Interesting. Interesting. But what you're talking about, yeah, it bears watching here. Bears watching here. So it's fascinating.
So what do you think is going to happen over the next 3, 6, 9 months, 2 years? You know, how do you see this whole Ukrainian situation evolving?
Well, it's eventually going to end. You know, the fighting will come. When people will be fought out. I mean, there are Russian people that don't want this war anyway. Yet, at the same time, Putin, and he understands this, they don't want NATO spreading. And you know who else doesn't want NATO spreading? The Chinese. And they'll fight this down to the last Russian, just like we'll fight this down to the last Ukrainian. And so here, interesting, you know, Putin understands the same thing Stalin understood. Germany invaded Russia, 1914. The Poles invaded Russia, 1919, in the Russo-Polish War, which people forget. But then the big one, Hitler, Operation Barbarossa. He threw 3,300,000 German troops against the Soviet Union. It is the greatest land war in modern times, and that's the land campaign that decided who was going to win the land war in the Second World War. We didn't win the land war. We, the Brits, the Free French, Canadians, and so on and so forth. The Soviets won the land war. They do this largely on their own. Lend-Lease was only 10-12% of the Soviet effort. They do this largely on their own. Cost them 25 million dead in 47 months. That's why in 1945, when Stalin occupied Eastern and Central Europe, you think he's leaving? Oh, he's not. In fact, the last time Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin meet at Yalta, you know, and Roosevelt's dying here anyway. You remember seeing photos of him? He looks terrible. He looks like death warmed over. Churchill is doing everything he can to get Stalin out of Poland. That's the linchpin here, Poland. He even tells Stalin, he says, if you don't get out of Poland, the Pope's not going to like this. You know what Stalin says to him? How many divisions does he have? Pope's a big fat 0. He doesn't have the Papal States anymore. He's on 108 acres. Who am I worried about? The Swiss Guard? He's got 300 divisions in Eastern Europe. He stays. Why? Because they don't want to be invaded anymore. That's why. You know, to these people, I like geography. I love geography. It's a chessboard. That's what it is. It's a chessboard. And that's how they see this. That's how they see this. And so, and you can't forget, Napoleon invaded Russia, didn't he? 1812. The Swedes invaded Russia long before the French. And then the Mongols coming in from the east savaged the other Rus. Now, these people live with this. We have no clue what that's like, but they live with this. So if you're going to understand this situation, try to understand that side of it. Because George Kennan said, remember George Kennan, the American foreign policy guru? He said in 1994, he told the Clinton administration, if you spread NATO into Eastern Europe, you are asking for a world of trouble. What's happened? Yeah. Although let's understand, Putin's a dictator and a thug. That's a long way from the militia system.
Okay, I think we only have time for one more question, if anyone has one.
No?
Guess not.
I guess that's about it. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.